everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone. Welcome to the ECCN webcast on improving the measurement of social and emotional learning for children in crisis. I'm Anjali Shivshankar. I'm the Senior Research Advisor for the Education and Conflict and Crisis team here at USAID. And I'm very excited to get this webinar started because USAID's new education policy, published in November of 2018, for the very first time named social and emotional skills as a category of learning outcomes that are critical for all children's success, but particularly children affected by conflict and crisis. As we know, crises pose a threat to children's learning and development, and in recent years, we've seen significant advances in programming that attempt to support and grow children's social and emotional skills, as well as their ability to learn. Yet, we currently lack the tools we need to measure social and emotional learning in crisis and conflict affected contexts. This makes it an enormous challenge to more specifically understand children's needs, to develop programs that really speak to these needs, and discuss the impact of our work. So today we have NYU's Global TIES Center and the International Rescue Committee who are joining us to talk about their work on SEL measure development testing and the demand across both practitioners, governments, and universities. So from the International Rescue Committee, we have Jamie Weiss-Yagoda, a Senior Education and Policy Advisor, and Dr. Silvia Diaz-Granados Ferranz, the Senior Research Advisor for Education. From NYU, we have Dr. Carly Tubbs-Dolan, who's the Director for Measurement and Metrics for the Education and Emergencies Initiatives, and Roxanne Karras, the Project Associate for the Metrics in Education and Emergencies Initiative. So as Jordan mentioned, please do use the chat. I'll monitor it for questions, and we'll save the questions until the end. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jamie Weiss-Yagoda from the IRC.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to USAID and ECCN for having us here today. I'm just going to give a quick overview to frame our webinar today. So the challenge that's really underscoring all of this, and the challenge that we face every day in our work as education and emergencies, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, is that we know that access is insufficient for truly having a meaningful impact on children's lives. We cannot just look at data on enrollment to know that we're having a positive impact, that even when children are in school, they may not be learning. Recent data from UNESCO found that globally, 6 out of every 10 children and adolescents, I believe it was 617 million worldwide, are not achieving minimum proficiency levels in reading and math. And at the primary level, 2/3 of these children who are not achieving minimum proficiency levels are in school. So we know that being in school is not enough. Why, if we're talking about math and literacy, are we talking about social emotional learning? We know that children affected by crisis are experiencing multiple barriers, interrupted education, language barriers in new countries, but we also know that one such barrier is their experience with crisis itself. Research shows us that children's experience with prolonged and severe adversity, such as through displacement and violence, can disrupt the healthy development of their brain, leading to difficulty learning. We also know from research in stable contexts that social emotional learning opportunities delivered in safe, supportive environments can reduce or reverse these negative effects. So promoting social emotional learning skills and well-being can also promote foundational academic outcomes. But there isn't a lot of evidence out there as to whether this holds true in crisis contexts. We don't know what works, as well as how, for whom, under what conditions, and at what cost. So to address barriers to children's learning and build the evidence we really need to answer all of these questions, we need the measurement tools that can generate quality evidence, and we're lacking them. As a field, we simply do not have enough high-quality, valid, reliable, easy-to-administer instruments to capture the information we need on children's learning outcomes in crisis contexts. So before going into more, I'd love to get to know a little bit more about all of you who are on this call today. So I've developed a survey for you all so I can get some more information on who's who. This is a quick survey, but I'd love it if you could all participate. I'm going to assume that everybody loves ice cream. So which is your favorite flavor? We have a quick poll that will appear on the right-hand side of your WebEx. And if you could answer by selecting the multiple choice, which is your favorite flavor? Chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry? I'll give everybody about 10, 15 more seconds to answer. When you enter, you can just click submit. Okay, let's see the results. Looks like we're pretty evenly split, but the majority is chocolate, with vanilla coming in second place and strawberry as the final one. So it looks like most people on this call, if we could see the results, looks like the majority of folks in this call are gregarious, impulsive, and hot-tempered, and enjoy being the center of attention. For all the vanillas and strawberries out there, you could also take a look and see what this says and what this is telling me about who you are and your personality. So I'm going to do another short poll. I'm curious as to whether you think that my ice cream survey was a good, accurate measure of your personality. If you could take a look at the right-hand side and just answer yes or no. Are you, in fact, quiet, shy, and introverted and very artistic for all you vanilla lovers? Strawberries? Do you find it difficult to feel your feelings? Let's see the results of that. Huh. It looks like the majority said no, that this was not, in fact, a good measure of your personality. So this was one way in asking the second question that I tried to validate my survey. I wanted to see if it was measuring what I wanted it to. If everybody's saying that it isn't, then is this a good measure of personality? Probably not. So this ice cream survey, shucks, it looks like it doesn't have any evidence of validity. It's not really giving me the information I want. It's not measuring what I wanted it to. So if you were using something like this to measure a program, and 44 out of 77 clients said that this wasn't accurate for them, would you be satisfied with this percentage saying that it didn't work for them? Is this enough? Can you trust the data it's yielding? Probably not. So as we know, there are significant risks in lacking the measures that we need to generate the data that we can trust. There are risks for practitioners, for policymakers, or for researchers. The lack of being able to generate quality evidence through trusted measures risks impacting critical program and resource and policy decisions in a way that may not positively impact children's lives, and worse, can risk negatively impacting children's lives. And it impacts us from moving towards really being an evidence-based field, one that generates and uses quality data to make program and policy decisions that can meaningfully impact children's lives. So we know that we need the data on what works to improve children's social emotional learning outcomes, and we need the right tools to help us collect this data. And that's what we have set out to accomplish as IRC and NYU and all of our partners. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Carly and Roxanne, now to tell us a little bit more about the initiative we're undertaking.
Thank you so much, Jamie. So as a starting point to doing some of this work and getting a better understanding of the needs in the field around measurement, we did a scoping study survey that had these 4 primary goals: to identify the skills and competencies which stakeholders would like to have more consistent, and by consistent we mean valid and reliable, a little bit like the example that Jamie showed with the ice cream survey information on. And then second goal, to map the use of research, monitoring, and evaluation across 4 types of stakeholders, specifically researchers, practitioners, government, civil servants, and funders. The third goal being to tabulate commonly used and established measurement tools, as well as bespoke measurement tools, so those that programs might be developing on their own. And finally, to understand stakeholders' perceptions of the barriers to monitoring, evaluation, and research. And we're going to talk about a few of the findings that we had from the survey today, but you should have received through the RSVP a brief with a link to the complete findings as well as a policy brief, and it's also available on the NYU Global TIES website if you're interested in more information on that. And to give a little bit of a background on how we organized the survey, it was really important to us to have a framework that was flexible to kind of reflect all of the different stakeholders that we were interested in collecting information from. And in order to do that, we based our framework off of one that was developed by the Learning Metrics Task Force, which some of you might be familiar with, but it was a group of stakeholders convened by UNESCO and the Brookings Institute, and it involved consultations from over 1,700 people in 118 countries. So what you see on the slide is the adapted version of the framework that we used, And what we kept consistent were these domains across age groups, so early childhood, primary, and post-primary. And then we made a few changes to make it more feasible to do a survey around this, one of them being rolling up the subdomains within each of those domains, because in the original framework, there's 30 to 50 subdomains, which is just not feasible to do within a survey. We also left out some of the more specific content areas. So for example, there were some domains around things like biology, and those felt a little bit more specific than we needed for the purposes of the survey. And finally, and really relevant to this webinar and what we're discussing today, we included a stronger focus on the domain of social emotional learning and really ensuring that we had good examples of social emotional skills and competencies across the different age groups that were included in the survey. And in terms of the methodology of how we conducted the survey, we distributed electronically between October and December of 2017 in both English and Arabic the survey to a few mailing lists. Some of you on this call might actually have taken it, so if you did, thank you. It did go through the ECCN email list, as well as through the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies and the International Education Funders Group, and a targeted mailing list of about 450 stakeholders that were names that we've kind of collected through our work over time. From that, we had about 347 people open the survey, and 179 ended up actually completing the full survey. Which for those who got all of the questions, it was a bit of an adaptive survey. It took 45 to 60 minutes, so we were really impressed with the response rate on such an involved survey. While it was a pretty large response rate, we want to be clear that it's not representative of the field overall, and that we really did target it to those working with children in crisis and vulnerable contexts, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey regions. And because of our affiliations as NGOs and researchers, we know that it's likely a sample that is much more familiar with those contexts and likely very research savvy. So the results that we're presenting are based on 176 respondents who reported working with children, youth, families, schools, and or teachers. Okay, so just briefly a little bit about who our respondents were so that you can have a bit of information about what they were reporting on. We had 50 researchers who responded, 102 practitioners, 17 funders, and 7 civil servants or those working in government. And you can see kind of the breakdown on the slide of the majority of the researchers were working in universities, followed by NGO implementing organizations. For practitioners, really a large majority in NGO implementing organizations, and then a bit of a breakdown across a few other sectors. Within the 17 funders, almost half are working in private foundations, and then equally balanced between bilateral and multilateral following. And in government, mostly at the national level, but also pretty good representation from regional and subnational civil servants. So here we wanted to show the areas of expertise that respondents reported working in. And if you look at the colors across the slides, they map across, so you can kind of get an idea of where people are working. For the full sample, the majority were working in adult education, so thinking about teacher training, professional development, and those types of things. And then there's a bit of breakdown across a few different sectors. You can see for practitioners, 47% reported working in emergency or crisis contexts. In governments, 57%, and for funders, 53%. So really well represented in our sample here. And here's another slide that shows kind of more detail in terms of what those crisis contexts look like. So 73% overall were working in crisis contexts, with the majority with refugees, migration, displacement, and post-conflict. Okay, and then as we said before, this really was a targeted sample, and this slide represents that. We had 61% of respondents working in the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey region, and then followed by East and West Africa as kind of the majority, and the rest are fairly evenly distributed. And in terms of the types of programs that respondents reported working with, one of the things that we found particularly interesting, as you can see on the graph on the left, is that 57% of the sample reported working with families as their primary beneficiaries, which is interesting thinking about kind of this idea of working with the whole child. So that was kind of an interesting finding that we saw in these results. And in terms of the age groups, most respondents reported working with kind of primary age 6 to 11, but you can see there's a pretty good distribution here. Then we were able to ask some additional questions about the types of monitoring and research activities that stakeholders engaged in. And here we really want to note that the term impact evaluation is used differently across different types of stakeholders. So for researchers, an impact evaluation typically means a really rigorous randomized controlled trial design, but that might vary for practitioners and donors and government. So we added in the survey some more specific explanation of what we meant by that, which for us was evaluating whether or not participants were better off in the program. So just keep that in mind when looking at these findings. And we can see that across researchers, practitioners, and government, 69% reported on evaluating whether or not participants in their program were better off, and 80% reported doing monitoring and evaluation or implementation research. And then we only asked researchers and practitioners to identify whether or not they were doing experimental research. So of those, 35% reported doing this more experimental research design, broken down that 64% of researchers and 20% of practitioners. And Carly's going to discuss a little bit why these findings are important for our work.
Sure, thank you. And so I think, this is striking. We know that it's not always feasible, particularly in these contexts, and it's not always the best use of resources to do an experimental impact evaluation. That being said, it's what's needed to build the evidence base on what works, how, and for whom for children in crisis contexts. The evidence on SEL comes primarily from over 213 studies as of 2011. I think now it's over 300 experimental research studies. And so that's what's allowed us to say that we really need to have social emotional learning programs in school. And right now, we're working with a very small evidence base in crisis contexts and thinking about how we can best build that and support that in a way that's feasible and meaningful. But as you'll see on the next slide, actually, this is part of a supply and demand issue. And so we looked at funders' responses, that while a majority of the funders do report requiring monitoring and evaluation activities, only 59% request or require that programs evaluate whether or not participants are better off. And so you start to see, why are people going to be generating that type of information if it's not something that they're funded or asked to do?
We then asked funders what they felt were the most important characteristics of evaluation. And do note that this is 17 funders who responded here, but we looked to see what organizations our respondents worked with, and these were 17 unique organizations. So good to note that there's not duplication here. But what we see as being the three most important areas were being useful for program and policy decision making, that data shows program impact or outcomes, and about 50% said that it was high quality was one of the things that were important. But one of the things that we think is really interesting in these findings is that only 31% report having rigorous scientific standards as something that's important to monitoring and evaluation activities.
Which we think is really challenging, because how can evidence be useful for program and policy decision making if it's not high quality? That means you're not going to be making
or there's not a good chance that you're going to be making decisions that are in the right direction and that are based on what is meaningful and accurate and consistent.
And I think the example that Jamie gave earlier with using the personality test with ice cream is something that is fun for this example, but when you're thinking about the implications more largely for making decisions around programming and for children, it's something that becomes really more of a serious concern. Okay, so there's a lot going on this slide, but a few things in terms of how to read it. We were interested in what the top barriers to doing research were, but we gave options to practitioners and civil servants that were a little bit different from funders. So if you look at the color scheme from the left to the right, you can see where there are similar options or the same options that were given across the two groups. The gray are all still important, but different options that were given to the two groups. So you can see that for practitioners and civil servants, 78% reported not having financial resources as a top barrier to doing research, as compared to 21% of funders. And this you can see as kind of being an inverse relationship in terms of some of those challenges around supply and demand. And then we can see that for practitioners and civil servants, they report that information is hard to interpret or act on as being a barrier, whereas 57% of funders. So we know that there might be some kind of miscommunication or challenges that exist there. And the third kind of point to compare across is that practitioners and civil servants identified, 17% identified that organizations do not prioritize M&E, and there's a similar percentage of funders that say the same. So what I think is really interesting for this group here is when we asked participants to identify which were the skills and competencies that they felt were most important to be able to measure. These are the findings that we found across all ages: interpersonal relationships and emotion processes. So given kind of that framework we showed earlier and the range of options, these social emotional competencies were really prioritized as a need for measurement. And then broken down by age group, which all of this is available in the briefs that I mentioned earlier. But we saw that when we look at the group of early childhood and primary school aged, internalizing and externalizing symptoms, literacy skills, and cognitive processes were prioritized. And then in secondary school aged, values were particularly prioritized.
Great, thank you. And so another piece of what we collected information about in the scoping study was who was engaged in research practice policy partnerships in the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey in order to support children's learning and development. And we focus here, and next slide, please. We focus here on research practice policy partnerships because we feel that they are particularly important for making sure both that the evidence is taken up and used by practitioners and policymakers, and also that that relationship goes the other way. So the questions that we're answering and the type of information we're providing is actually usable and actionable. So through the scoping study survey, we identified research practice policy partnerships and requested applications to join the Education Emergencies, Evidence for Action Measurement Consortium in MENA. The goal of that consortium actually ended up being was to, at least by 2019, to provide a set of measurement tools as well as guidance materials that we were confident had evidence as to whether the tools were actually meaningful and accurate in the context in which we were working. And so how we did that and who the partnerships are, so we're going to talk through that a little bit. And so what you can see is there are 7 partnerships aside from our own between IRC and NYU. The partnerships take a variety of forms, and so there's research practice policy partnerships between universities, that are practice-oriented and research-oriented, partnerships between NGOs and government, partnerships between universities and government. And so we have a wide variety of different types of partnerships working in about 5 different contexts. So Lebanon with vulnerable Lebanese children, Lebanon with Syrian refugee children, Gaza, Iraq, Turkey with Syrian refugee children and vulnerable Turkish children. And so what we did is we brought everybody to a workshop about a year ago at this point, and brought them 4 types of information. One was the information that from the scoping study survey. Another type was evidence of what skills are most important for children. Another type was measurement inventories that have been developed that we can share about what tools actually exist in these contexts. And then finally, we relied very heavily on consortium members' own perceptions of what skills were most important in the context and what they're working. So with that, we developed a measurement research agenda that participants the consortium members submitted proposals to develop measurement tools to address. And so you can see on this graphic right here, a lot of what's being targeted in terms of the measurement tool development. So ranging from comprehensive SEL measures that include things like sense of safety and hope, persistence, self-perception, to mental health measures that are very deeply contextualized for the context, as well as measures of how SEL programs are being implemented and the quality required to deliver those programs. And so the goal of all of this is that this will become an INEE, International Network for Education Emergencies Toolkit. And in version what we're calling 1.0, which will be ready in fall of 2019, it will include the consortium measurement tools and a measurement inventory, as well as guidance materials. And the goal of this is that it would be very user-friendly and interactive, have search functions, and is updatable. We would refer you to see resources on the CASEL website, on the RAND website, for examples from US of what we're thinking about. Eventually, we hope that it becomes a community of practice to share how measures have been adapted, to share data to allow us to build that evidence base. But I think one of the things that we're really focused on that's come out very strongly in the work is that a tool is really just a tool. And what matters is the fit in the decisions made between what you're measuring and how you're intending to use the data and who is doing the reporting and how it's adapted. And all of those things together is what's going to determine whether you have data that is reliable and meaningful. And so because of that, our colleague Sylvia has worked to develop a decision-making tree to help guide this process of choosing a tool. And so I'm going to turn it over to her now to talk through.
Thank you, Carly. So yeah, as Carly mentioned, our toolkit will include some guidance materials to help people, practitioners, researchers, anyone interested in using measures to assess outcomes, so they can choose their measures. So the toolkit will include a decision-making tree that will come along a narrative that will guide people step by step, as well as, and it will be linked to the inventory of measures and of tools that we will include in the toolkit. So basically, this decision-making tree, we want to use it to guide everyone in the process of choosing, contextualizing, and collecting evidence of validity and reliability on the education measures that we will include. And as I said, it comes linked to a narrative and to different resources, as well as to an inventory of measures. So when trying to identify a measure, when you go to the toolkit and you try to identify among the different things that we will be including, what is the right measure for you, you first need to really, you would have identified your research question and why do you want to conduct a study. And so you need to go into the toolkit and try to first identify if there's any instrument that captures the project's research constructs. So in other words, you want to see, you want to be able to identify what are you interested in assessing. So in order to do that, reviewing your theory of change, or your log frame can help you identify this information. So to answer this question, one of the common things that you need to see is like the different assessment dimensions in the field of education. This can be literacy, that can include constructs such as oral reading fluency, reading comprehension, numeracy skills, things like operations, addition, subtraction, things like that. Social emotional competencies, constructs such as cognitive, emotional, interpersonal processes. There are dimensions that we have included here that may be related to physical well-being, mental health, cognitive processes. So, in addition to identifying the dimensions that you want to measure, you also need to consider what are the types of competencies that you want to capture. And types of competencies may include knowledge, which are basically the ability to recollect facts, information, concepts, skills, which is the functional ability to do things such as adding numbers, reading with fluency, cooperating with others to solve conflicts, behaviors that reflect how people act and conduct themselves, and attitudes, which are basically the underlying beliefs that may guide how you act. And so our inventory of our toolkit will have an inventory of measures that will include information about the dimension, the construct, the type of competencies that each measures capture. So when choosing a measure, you also need to consider the purpose of the assessment. Please go next. Sorry. So when you ask this question, there are different things that may happen. If there's an instrument in the inventory that actually captures the research questions that you're interested, that's a question that you need to ask. And if you don't find anything there, you need to ask yourself whether you have the time and resources to develop a new instrument. And if yes, we suggest that you then go ahead and start the process. But if no, we suggest that you find in the toolkit or in other resources that we'll be providing an instrument that captures a variable that can serve as a proxy. However, if you find that, yes, there is in the inventory an instrument that captures the project's key research questions, then the next thing that you need to ask yourself is whether the instrument that you have identified was designed in a way that aligns with your assessment purposes. And so when trying to consider the assessment purposes, you're trying to you need to think of like what are you going to use the instrument for, because different instruments are designed for different purposes. Some are trying to describe and compare, some are trying to track students, some are trying to screen students, some are trying to monitor, some are trying to conduct program evaluation or evaluating the impact of an intervention on students' outcomes. And so this is important. It's important that you identify a tool that adequately responds to the needs of your assessment, because not all tools are adequate for different purposes. For example, there are tools that have been developed to assess the impact of a program, and they cannot always be used, for example, for purposes of screening individuals and tracking them into, let's say, different interventions according to their developmental needs. And similarly, tools that have been developed to screen individuals may not be adequate enough for the purposes of program evaluation. So when you're trying to choose a measure, you need to then also, in addition to consider the assessment purpose, it's also important that perhaps you look at what are the assessment types. And this can include self-reports, performance-based reports, observation tools, social network analysis tools, the different types of tools. And it is important that you also consider this, because there are different advantages and disadvantages of different types, and some tools are more adequate to capture the types of competencies that you're interested in. For instance, performance-based, and there are different advantages and disadvantages. For instance, performance-based instruments can evaluate specific aspects of a participant's skills that are way more valid than self-reports, because people tend to overestimate or underestimate how what their skills are. And but then self-reports have some advantages, which are they're easier to administer. Sometimes they are less costly, and they are less time-consuming that performance-based measures. So all in all, you basically need to be very aware of what are the advantages and disadvantages of different types of instruments. So when you ask ask yourself that question, whether the instrument in the inventory that you have chosen is adequate for your assessment purpose. If the answer is no, then you need to find an instrument that aligns with the assessment purpose. But if, on the other hand, the answer is yes, then you need to ask yourself another question, which is like whether the instrument has been used with the population that you're trying to target, or if it's been used in the context that you're trying to target. And this is very important because um, not, the tools that have been used in some context may not function in similar ways if they have been used in a different context. So some important variables that you need to consider is, like, for example, the language, the age group, whether here, for example, we will provide information about whether the tool has been used for early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and you also need to consider the context, whether it's a high, middle income, low income country, an emergency, or a stable setting. And so our inventory will also provide information about the population and the settings in which it has been used. So once you have asked yourself that question, whether if the instrument has been used with the population that you want to target, if the answer is no, then you're going to have to perhaps take that measure, but then you need to engage in a process, in a multi-step process of contextualizing and conducting, um, uh, translating the tool, conducting cognitive pretesting with the target population, and also piloting the tool. Please go next, Rebecca. Yeah. So conducting piloting the tool to see whether the measure is valid and reliable. So how do you contextualize a measure? Mhm. Well, the toolkit will include actually guidance, support instruments, and as well as some technical guidance on how to engage in the process of contextualizing. At the very minimum, it includes 3 steps. The first one, which is translating the instrument, and in order to do this well, it is important that you really try to preserve the original meaning of all the items. And then, an effective way to do this is like to translate the tool into the target language and to back translate the tool into the original language to make sure that the meaning has not changed. Then you need to engage in a process of cognitive pretesting, which is a process that will help you understand whether the population you're working with are actually understanding the assessment in the way you intend. So it usually involves asking respondents to read the items out loud, to restate them in their own words, to say how or why would they like what their answer is, but why or how, um, how they're interpreting the questions. And so in doing this process, you will also be able to identify common misunderstandings and then use the information to further refine and adjust the measure. Uh, Finally, then you need to engage in a process of piloting, conducting a small pilot, which is basically to collect data with a small sample of students, not of students, but with the target population that you're interested in, under field conditions. And so piloting the instrument can help you identify potential problems during the administration of the tool. It can also help you take action to prevent all the potential problems. But most importantly, piloting the tool, the importance of piloting the tool is that you will be able to have some access to some data that will help you determine whether the instrument is functioning in a reliable way with the target population and in the setting that you're interested to work. So the toolkit will include also some guidance on how to conduct the piloting. So once you have conducted the process, actually, so on the other hand, if your answer is like yes, the instrument has been used with your target population, then you need to ask yourself whether there's evidence of validity and reliability. And that's also the same question that you would need to ask yourself if you have engaged in the process of contextualizing the instrument. So what is validity and reliability? Reliability basically is a measure of the stability of an assessment, the degree to which a measure is yielding the same results across different items, different raters, or different occasions. And so there are different measures of reliability, including internal reliability, inter-rater reliability, test-pretest reliability. We provide guidance on how to collect, how to analyze information on reliability in the toolkit. Validity, on the other hand, refers to the degree to which an instrument is actually measuring what you think it's measuring. It's actually capturing and targeting well the specific construct that you think is measuring. So here, for example, you can see in the graph how there's some measures that can be reliable, but they're not valid. Some that are like valid but not reliable. Some that are not neither reliable nor valid, and some others are both reliable and valid. So it is very important And in the process, the measures that we will be including in the toolkit are those measures for which we have evidence of both validity and reliability. So if you don't have evidence of validity and reliability, then you need to continue piloting the instrument, continue to engage in a process of refining. And so you need to continue engaging the process of refining the items of the instrument through the process of contextualization. And if you don't have evidence of validity and reliability, you just need to continue refining. But if you do, on the other hand, if you do find evidence of validity and reliability, you can go ahead and use the instrument. And so, so to wrap up, the toolkit will provide we will provide with guidance materials, including the decision-making tree, a technical narrative to guide your decisions to choose to choose the measures along with the way, and link to an inventory of measures that will contain relevant information. For example, here I show an example of the information that will be available for each tool. This is children's stories. It's a measure. It's a measure that the IRC and NYU have been developing, and it's what dimension. So it's a measure that is capturing social emotional learning. It's in that dimension, and what are the specific constructs. So uh, uh, it's capturing hostile attribution bias, which is when basically the cognitive tendency to interpret the actions of others as having hostile intent, even in situations that may be ambiguous. Anger and sadness dysregulation, orientations toward conflict resolution. Some people, when they face a conflict, they tend to respond with aggression, or some others disengage, some others actually engage in positive problem solving. And so these are some of the constructs that children's stories captures. For what assessment purpose? So this specific tool, we have been using it for the purposes of program evaluation and research. It's not a tool. If you're interested, for example, in screening individuals, this is not a tool that you could use for screening. What type of assessment? Is a self-report, but it's scenario-based in the sense that the tool asks children to imagine that they are in a specific situation, and then they say what would they do in different in different scenarios. We have been using it for children in middle childhood and adolescence. We have used it in Lebanon. In Lebanon, the measure is available in Arabic. In Niger, the measure is available in French. In Nigeria, the measure is available in Hausa. What evidence of reliability? So, currently, and this will be updated because the measure we are conducting, but this is just for the purposes of an example, and I included here the evidence of reliability that is specifically of Nigeria. So Cronbach's alpha is a measure of internal reliability in the range of 0.70 and 0.90, and that basically reflects uh, good reliability. And what evidence of validity? So we have some information about convergent, divergent validity, criterion reliability. If you the technical document that goes along with the decision-making tree explains each of these concepts. We'll be happy to discuss, but all the information and guidance is available in the toolkit. So with that said, back to Anjali.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Roxanne and Carly. That was really incredibly fascinating. So many people actually sent in questions in advance of this webinar. So a couple of questions were posted in the chat, but I'll actually start with a few sets of questions that we received in advance because there were a lot of similarities. So quite a few have to do with the toolkit itself. So I know that you mentioned that the toolkit will be ready fall of 2019, and that inside the toolkit, there's actually many, many different types of measures that are relevant for different types of settings, different purposes, the use of the tool, and that you'll provide all the psychometric information about the validity and reliability of the tool. Could you talk a little bit about a couple of things? So I think one, we'll kick off with, what if someone wants to use some of these tools before the toolkit is actually released? Is there a possibility to do that? Yes. So we'll start with that question.
Sure. Thank you so much. And it's really exciting to have all the questions around this. It's been a long year and a half, and we're really excited that we're actually getting to this part of the process. So the answer to that question is, it depends. And so some of the tools and some of the partnerships are in a later stage of development of doing, more secondary analysis on the measurement properties. And some of them are just right now being developed and tested. So if you have questions about that, happy for you to reach out to us, and we can help direct you. Also, share some of these inventories and links to the inventories that could provide alternatives as well, not just the consortium members' tools, but the World Bank has an inventory, FHI 360 has an inventory, NYU has an inventory, and so there's a lot that's actually out there that you can use to draw on.
I mean, it is also possible that we could provide more information about the specific tools that we're testing, so that, let's say, in case you're writing a proposal that where you don't need the tool immediately, but you need to perhaps say or include information about the specific tools that you're considering. The tools won't be available until we actually have evidence, validity, and reliability. But the information of which tools we're testing, that's something that we may be able to make available.
Great, thanks. And I think a follow-up to that question, several people asked, so I think it was clear in your presentation that the tools actually cover a very wide variety of age groups. So it does cover early childhood, it covers school-age kids, primary school-age kids, and also teenagers. People had a wide variety of questions about both how you actually carry out testing with those populations, both from the practical data collection perspective, but also from an ethical perspective, as well as questions about languages and how you navigate that, as well as questions which, Sylvia, I think you touched on a little bit in the cognitive testing and piloting portion of the decision tree, but how you actually make sure that you're measuring something in a culturally appropriate way in an emergency setting. So I think I'll ask perhaps Sylvia to start off. Does the toolkit itself give you guidance on those types of questions, or is that something that people will have to get somewhere else?
So the toolkit itself will provide, and the inventory and the tools will say where the tool has been tested, in what populations the tool has been tested, with the age groups, languages, and things like that. But I think, again, the decision-making tree will help you make decisions about whether you need to engage in a process of contextualizing the measures for the purposes of using them in a different setting. If the measures that we have prioritized this time are in the MENA region, the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. And so if you are working in a different setting and the measures have not been tested there, you need to engage in a process of contextualizing, and the decision-making tree will come with a narrative that will provide resources and explain what are the best practices to translate, what are the how to conduct a cognitive pretesting, if you are going to pilot it, what are the statistics or the type of analysis or the type of evidence that you need to collect to see whether the tool is valid and reliable. So that narrative will guide people in the process. It's a little technical, but we also have tried to make it as simple as possible, but it involves technical processes, but we hope it will be helpful for those that for anyone who wants to use the measures in languages or in contexts that have not previously been used.
To add on, so I think one of the areas that we really tried to focus in the toolkit is on the enumerator training materials, which is where a lot of this happens around language and around ethics. At our second workshop a couple months ago, we had an entire session around it, and thinking about how you can build in those child protections into that process, how you can build in the adaptation process into enumerator training, and that's a methodology that Save the Children has used a lot with their IDELA and ICELA tools. And so thinking about how we can use that process to ensure the contextualization and the appropriateness of the tools. There will be those materials included in the toolkit, but I think one of the things that we really want to emphasize is that this is really toolkit version 1.0. And we envision it as a living toolkit that we can really add to and add these materials, and that your reflections on adapting them and ensuring their appropriateness can come back so that it really is more of a community of practice.
Excellent. So we have, so I think then that answers quite a few of the participants' questions about ethics, about language, about cultural adaptation, about adaptation to a crisis and conflict context. So it sounds like the toolkit will actually be extremely comprehensive. But Charles and Zaymana, to confirm the answer to your question, that is correct, that they're still testing the tools, although it is possible to reach out and explore whether a partnership in testing tools is possible at this time. So I do want to then turn it to some more specific examples, because I know both IRC and NYU, in coordination with several other partners, have obviously been in the process of creating, piloting, adapting all of these measures in a wide variety of settings. So I would actually love to invite each person from the panel to share one example of a scenario where there could be, maybe it was a very challenging example, maybe there was a wonderful success, but just to give the participants a really concrete sense of what the work has looked like so far. So Roxanne, Carly, I'll start off with you.
So I think actually, and if I've seen the questions right, related to an effort, the whole of Syria education cannot wait effort, is a process that we engaged in, that we did secondary analysis on a lot of existing data sets, EGMA, so beyond social emotional learning, and then met with a group of experts from within the region, academics, to interpret that evidence and what it was saying about how the tools were working. And based on that, understanding how we might want to adapt the tools for future piloting. And I think we felt that we had time, which was very important. A lot of times, like, you're fielding these tools, you don't have the time to go through that process. But we felt like it was at least we haven't gotten the results, or we haven't done the results yet, the analysis yet, but we were optimistic about the process, I think in part because it really used existing data, which is this untapped resource that we can learn so much from, spend a lot of time and money collecting it, so let's use it. And also in terms of the mix between the deep contextualization and the empiricism, we felt like it was a very theoretically and empirically grounded process. So that was a good example.
I think in thinking about also NYU and IRC as partners within the consortium as well, and Sylvia shared a little bit about the children's stories measure, which is one of the ones that we're planning to include in the toolkit. There's another one, which is a teacher classroom observation tool that the IRC has been working on for a really long time. And something I think that's been really exciting in this process is we've been able to do some testing of inter-rater reliability using videos, and really being able to have the same people who would be using this measurement tool for kind of a formative purpose in the classroom, being able to code the tool, and then we were able to bring in a human-centered designer who really worked very closely with the team on the ground there to make these adaptations, and we're able to now test again to see if those changes improve the inter-rater reliability on the measurement tool. So I know there's a lot of challenges also, and it's exciting to be able to have a couple examples of things that are going really well with this process as well.
Great. Sylvia, from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't have much to add in the sense that the specific measures that we're testing, I think those are a couple of good examples. I do want to also acknowledge that many of the measures that we will be including in the toolkit have been and are being developed by other partnerships that are not IRC and NYU, and so many members may be even attending the webcast, and so they could also share some of those examples of the challenges that they have experienced. But I agree. For example, a good one of the interesting cases, and that is the teacher classroom observation measure, where the challenge to increase the precision with which, not just the precision, but the stability with which different raters observe the quality of a classroom. That's been something that has really pushed us to come up with different ways to improve the reliability of a tool like the videos that Roxanne has been discussing.
Excellent. And then Jamie, actually, I'll ask you to comment on a related question that we got from the chat, which is how have these tools been integrated into either national education systems, in terms of benchmarks, or have they been used at a policy level in other ways in partnership with host governments?
I'll actually kick it back to my colleagues, Carly and Roxanne, since they're more familiar with the background to the tools that are being adapted and piloted themselves.
Sure. So I think that's a great question, and we have a few government partners in the consortium. I think at this point, given the stakes of what it means to have a national assessment tool and the foundations that you need to make sure that that's meaningful. And then there's another partnership who's taking a different approach in testing a much more granular measure that may or may not be integrated at that national level. And so to the extent that we are not at the point where there are benchmarks or standards, one of the big challenges in this populations that we work in is that it's really hard to get a population representative sample. It's really hard to get the size needed for that with the cost. And so I think as we're moving forward to thinking about what a second phase of this work could look like, one of our major priorities is trying to think about how we could get the population representative samples and the scale that we need in order to provide some of that information, because we've really heard that it's a pressing concern for a lot of stakeholders.
Excellent. So we are at time, so I'll go ahead and wrap us up. I do want to make sure that everyone is aware that both the slides, the presenter contact information, and the recording is going to be posted on the Education and Conflict and Crisis Network, along with the briefs that do contain further details on the research that Roxanne and Carly presented and the toolkit that Sylvia laid out for us. I do encourage you all to definitely join ECCN if you haven't already. It's an excellent community of practice that is going to focus on driving this work forward. And we thank you again for your time today.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your interest and for attending and your great questions.